I think that when somebody does demonstrate that they are a risk, the adult or an older child for that matter, we need to take additional steps, not simply say, well, this person has gone to the altar and so they've been fully restored. And so now I don't want to make them look bad or feel bad. So we'll let them continue because this is now under the blood.
Yes.
And
yes.
I heard Sarah Fry say, if it's sometimes under the blood means under the rug. And,
very good. Very good.
A situation where we're allowing kids to continue to be victimized by not speaking to the issue.
Get ready, set, go.
What's going on, everybody?
What's up? What's up?
Yeah, Mike. We got a little different setup tonight, and
We do.
I'm gonna have to lean in my mic. I don't know if I like this. Going back to some of the early days.
I know. Like, we don't have those fancy ones that have the stands, and we can just like play with them like while we're talking.
Yeah.
Now it has to be on the table, just stationary.
Yes, indeed. We got a packed episode this evening. We got Cam Rye in Indiana. Old Faithful over there, old Canaan.
Oh, faithful boyfriend.
Try to be.
This time we got Jon Hopkins back on the show. John, are you he's the second return guest, right?
I think he is. Second
Yes,
time
sir.
coming on.
Yeah, man. He's back again. People just can't help themselves. Long time
listener, second time caller.
Yeah, long time listener. He's one of three.
He comes back. That's all that matters.
And we got a guest today. I've been looking forward to talking to him ever since he reached out to us. We got Dr. Andrew Graham, and I really don't know how to. We're not used to having somebody your caliber on here. Is what I'm trying to say.
That is correct. We'll let him do the introducing of himself and his background and stuff. But
first,
yes.
let's get into what led us to this.
Okay.
Because me and Kanan were on here. We recorded that episode. What, Kanan? About 3 weeks ago, something like that.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
And me and him were on here running our mouth as usual, and we were talking about the video that Jon Hopkins had posted, and we started discussing about, all right, it's easy to get on here and just throw shade
Right.
at Holiness Church or at church in general, but what do we suggest?
Yeah.
And that's where I realized I had nothing to say, and that's a bad feeling.
Me neither.
So Andrew listens to the podcast, and he reached out and he said, if you're serious about this, let me know. So that started a conversation, and here we all sit this evening.
Yeah. And I remember when you told me about this, and I was like, oh, that would be so awesome to be able to actually have some answers by someone who's trained, because we know of incidences that have happened and we just are really clueless as how do we either prevent, how do we bring attention to, like, what is the good educated way to handle these situations?
Right. And this ball kind of got started rolling when we had David Eicher on. He started telling things that really kind of spooked me. And it seemed like it was a topic that just kept coming back up. John, you asked to be on the show tonight, and I was really glad you did, because I was wanting to get you on at some point anyways. You released that video there. How long has it been now?
Oh, dude, I don't even know. Like a month, maybe not that long.
We posted over on the podcast Facebook page, so people, it's still up there, and I'll reshare it again so it's at the top of the feed so people can see it. What kind of feedback you've been getting from that, John?
Well, last time I looked, which I'm not sure when that was, it had over 5,000 people view it. And
wow.
Even I think it was Monday it was Thursday of last week. I think I talked to you, Phil, and I've still been getting messages from people talking about it, kind of some of them even talking about their own trauma. And so, yeah, it's been, I guess, negatively positive feedback, if that makes sense. Not something you want to hear, but something I'm glad that people are able to talk about, which is the whole reason why I shared it in the first place, was just so that hopefully people would feel freer to talk about the stuff that they were facing or have faced.
And for new listeners, what John's talking about is he was able to confront someone who abused him as a child. Mm-hmm. And so he's been able to talk to him and just let him know how his life has not been damaged to the point of no return. There is hope. There's a future. Mm-hmm. And I'm sorry to get emotional about this, but John, just watching that video, you had my mother in tears. You had my dad just like listening, and he's like, I had no idea this is what was going on in the holiness movement, you know, because that's all I've ever known. My dad had no idea that I was one of the victims as well, until I was older. I was 31 when Dad found out. And so this is a really sensitive subject, and it's not for everybody. So let's just put out a trigger warning. This might not be for a lot of people, a lot of listeners.
One of those.
Yes.
Yep.
But anyways, sorry, guys.
John, before we really dive into it, I also wanted to tell you publicly, and we've discussed it amongst ourselves, but the way that you modeled the Christian response to that guy in the video where you confronted him, it still blows my mind, and I just wanted to give you props for that.
Yes.
Yeah.
It was very impressive.
Like I told you when we talked about it, to be 1,000% honest, that was not thoughts that were going through my head. I was praying like crazy.
I am sure.
The whole day leading up to it, because I was like, God, you know, I've got to show you. I've got to show your spirit in this, even though that's not necessarily how I feel,
right,
or how I have felt. And so I honestly had no idea what I said until I went back and watched it later, which was not a good idea. But
yeah.
Great self-control, though, man. Wow.
Yeah, it made me do some reflecting on my own spiritual status. That's how impressive it was to me.
Just the power of forgiveness. Like, you know, when the Holy Spirit's able to just move on you and be able to speak for you when you cannot speak for yourself. Mm-hmm. Like you said, like in his head, I'm sure he wanted to cry, he wanted to scream, he wanted to say a lot of things, but he didn't. And that's the power of God's forgiveness.
Yep. Let's bring in Andrew here into this. Why don't you give us a little bit of your background and your credentials and so forth, and let everybody know who we're talking to here.
Yeah, sure. It's an honor to be able to join you all. And I am a podcast listener throughout the day. I walk back and forth to work, and so I often listen to podcasts. And actually, the episode you were just mentioning with the Anabaptist guy, I think somebody had recommended I listen to that, and I've listened to a bunch of episodes since then. And so, when I heard you guys talking about, we don't know what to do, we just know there's a problem, thought, maybe I'll reach out. So, I attended, I know you guys have mentioned Hope Sound Bible College before. I attended here in the late 90s and graduated from here, went off, did a master's degree and worked in Eastern Kentucky in community mental health. And then went from there to the upstate of South Carolina, so still sort of an Appalachian population, and then to Central Virginia, which is where I did my doctorate. And all that time I worked in community settings, not in religious settings. I mean, I was a believer. I am a believer, a person of faith, Christian, but my counseling was always in, agency work. So my Bible was in my desk, not on my desk, and I prayed for clients, but not ever with them. Mm-hmm. And as we got to the end of my PhD, I really felt like maybe I needed to make a switch and work more in the church. There had been actually a holiness evangelist had been through town and took me out to eat and was talking to me about, basically asked me if I was doing anything to serve the church. And I was like, well, I'm tithing, singing the church quartet every once in a while, but not really besides that. And he was like, no, you need to, people need to hear about counseling and to hear about helping hurting people. So I moved, my family and I, after I graduated, moved back to Hope Sound, and I started the counseling program up through about 2020. I taught there. And I think the biggest surprise was that I assumed that I would be bored, because rather than working with kids who'd been abused and adults who were victims of abuse, which is a lot of what I did in community mental health, that I would be bored. Like it would be families who were saying, we're an 8.5 out of 10 and we want to be a 9.
Yeah.
And I was perhaps pretty naive to realize that when I started identifying myself as a confidential person for people to reach out to, that even people from our shared faith tradition would reach out and say, hey, here's, since I know you can't ever tell anyone, here's what really happened to me. And it was a real adjustment for me to go from hearing stories from kids who I'd never see in the community, except when I saw them in my office, to suddenly, hearing disclosures of people, the children of pastors or children of lay leaders and evangelists and stuff like that reach out and say, I need to make a disclosure and I need somebody to, sometimes for counseling, sometimes I just need to tell somebody so that I don't keep all this stuff in.
Right.
And but yeah, that's been a part of my. So I still teach. I teach online for several Christian universities, and then I have a counseling practice. But yeah, it's been a thing here lately, is people wanting to talk about what should we have done in some of these situations where people. From John's video, I'm not sure anybody knew and withheld information, but there certainly are those cases as well, where parents and church leaders were aware that something was going on and didn't do something. And I'd be interested in John's situation as to whether or not he just didn't feel safe in going to anyone because he didn't feel like he would be believed. Because I feel like that's a common narrative as well. So talking about, what we should do as parents, as, we're lay leaders too, right? I mean, I'm in my 40s, not quite that old, but, what are we doing to foster an environment where kids are kept safe? And if something's happening to them, they have identified us as safe people who will help them to navigate what's going on with them.
That's good questions. Do you have answers for a lot of these questions? Are you still kind of, I know you're trained in this, I'm not questioning that at all. But like, how do we move forward, I guess, is going to be my question. That's my big question.
Well, I think there's something too that he mentioned that caught my attention, how he felt the need for people to know about counseling.
Right.
Because it seemed like, and Andrew, Kanan, John, maybe Mariah, maybe it was different in your old circles, because I had I was in the very conservative side of the movement,
right?
But then was also in West Virginia, which is a different culture, and counseling was almost looked at as something that you don't need that.
Counseling was looked down upon, very much so.
It was looked down.
It was. You needed more prayer.
Yeah. Basically, I mean, it's sad, but basically that was the approach to it.
Right.
So, Andrew, what kind of a hurdle was that? Was it hard to try to spread that message just in of itself?
Yeah. So I'm a really big guy, and I am pretty secure in who I am and what God's called me to be. You guys have talked about traveling in PR groups, ministry teams, and stuff like that, and I did that when I was in Bible college. And, I was a ministerial major, so I took all the homiletics classes, but I knew that I would never, that wasn't, pastoral ministry isn't what God was calling me to. But I would go to these youth camps and I would talk to kids at the altar. I mean, I was only a year or 2 or 3 older than they were, or we'd sit around at the dorm late at night. And I was like, you know what? This is what God wants me to do. And it's great to be a good listener, but I want the tools and the information so that when somebody stops talking, I can say something back to them that's helpful. Yeah. And so, I definitely had people try to talk me out of that. Absolutely, definitely. And no, this is who I am. This is what God wants me to do. Get out of the way. And I've had a number of people over the years have reached out to me and said, I remember one guy who was really bothered about the fact that I would do that. I mean, he said something to the effect of, like, if you can speak plainly in front of people, then God's called you to preach, and you're just fighting a call to preach. And quite a few years later, I saw that same guy, and he came up to me and said, "Man, I am so glad you listen to God rather than listening to me, because we need people who are willing and able to do what you're doing." So. Yes. Even at Hope Sound, I mean, there was a counseling minor, but it was always sort of a pastoral role, not really, that somebody would pursue licensure and all of that sort of stuff.
That's something, because it was always kind of going joke and being. I mentioned it to Andrew. Hope Sound was looked at as the more progressive one out of the Holy Spirit.
Yeah, it was the more worldly out of all of them, of the Bible colleges.
And so it wasn't even as focused there,
right?
As much as
my mom also went to Hope Sound, and she loved her time there. She was there. Oh, it was in their 80s, I believe it was. I think it was like 83 to 87, something like that, when my mom went there, and she absolutely loved it.
Back up to one thing there, and because I think this is where Jon's video is just absolutely so powerful, is that, we can, the conservative evangelical church, conservative holiness movement, whatever term is best, there are, it was easy to look at, a Bill Cosby, a Bill Clinton, sort of a serial philanderer, Howard Weinstein, stuff like that, and be really critical of people like that, and rightfully so. I'm not against being critical of that. And then suddenly it was Bill Gothard, and then it was the guy out in Colorado, and so it was like, well, this isn't holiness movement stuff. Like, these people aren't really, then it was Ravi Zacharias, and it was still like, people still put their hands up and said, like, yeah, but that's still out there,
right?
That's not in here. And so for Jon to not necessarily name names, I mean, we name specific denominations and those sorts of things, but like, I think that's the power in Jon's voice in all of this, is saying, no, this isn't all that stuff way out there. Like, this is right here. And there were people, in the vicinity. Like, this was, I was not properly stewarded, in that moment while in the care of godly people. And so, yeah, I think so the whole conversation goes back to being willing to acknowledge that there are systems in place that allow the sort of victimization that happened to Jon, and that don't respond necessarily in the right way in order to prevent that from happening again, or provide some sort of care to those who've been victims already.
It seems like it hits a little too close to home, and no one wants to address it. And then you have incidences like Jon, like you said, Jon, like the doctor had just mentioned, I would be very interested to see, like, did you feel like you couldn't say what you, feel free to not answer this. Did you feel like you couldn't say anything? Why did you speak up suddenly? Because I know I kept quiet for years, like 21 plus years personally. What was your reasoning? And I know you mentioned statistics too with your personal experiences. So could you answer those questions for me?
Yeah. So I guess I talked to my parents about it when I was older. I was 18 or 19. Then it was kind of a thing that it had happened so long prior to that. And people just really, it wasn't taught, like, how do we deal with this, even for them as parents. And I've said it in my video, and I try to say it every time that I talk about this in a public setting, because I want people to know that I do not blame my parents for any of my trauma.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Because they did the best that they knew how to do in the situation. But that's the whole problem. They did the best they knew how. They weren't equipped with how to deal with that situation.
Right.
So the reason, I guess, that it came about now is that I was just quite simply just put in contact with the people that run Predator Catchers Indianapolis because of working with one of the ladies. So that kind of just put it out there. And then she told me, I had worked with her for quite a while, and we talked about my trauma, because I'm pretty open talking about it at this point in my life. And so she had told me that the man who had abused me as a kid had started messaging them. And it was kind of a thing where she put it out there, hey, like, if you want to confront him, you can. Don't feel pressure to.
Right.
But sometimes victims want to. And if you want to, we will let you when the time comes. So that's kind of how that, I guess, came about, was just the fact that it was timing, him talking to one of the decoys that just so happened to be from them. So there was just a lot of timing, I guess, in it, that it just happened the way it did. And then, of course, my wife has her master's degree in social work. So that has helped lead me to a better spot of healing than I would have been at a long time ago as well.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure.
Just because she's constantly nagging at me to get help with this or get help with that, like a normal wife would, except where she has a degree.
Right.
Yeah.
That video of PCI that wound up making national news, didn't it, John? Are them catching
Yeah.
the guy?
So I think like Fox, and the biggest probably news outlet that shared it was Daily Mail, just because that's on a lot of social media websites.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it did. The actual video of the catch, or news clips of it or whatever, went everywhere just because of the status that he had with whatever it was, Meta, whatever, essentially the parent company or sister company of Facebook.
Yeah, that seemed to draw a lot of attention to it by how high up he was in that company. Yeah, for sure.
And then you said something about statistics, Missy.
Yes.
So another interesting thing that I found was that after I posted my video and a lot of people in the church world saw it, it was interesting to me that probably a good 80% of people that messaged me and said, hey, this happened to me, I just haven't really talked about it, were all people that, of course, I traveled in PR, so I know a lot of people.
Right.
But were almost all people that I know or know of that grew up in the same circles that we all grew up in.
Right.
And that, considering the number of people that messaged me, that's a large number.
Yes.
And some of them, my age, some of them older than my parents, messaging me. So it's not even like it's a new thing either. It's been happening for years. It's just not talked about.
That makes me think about something there where, Andrew, you'd mentioned about listening to the one with David Eicher, and David said something that caught my attention. David, I believe, just started focusing on the things in his circles,
right?
Which was the Mennonite circles, and he talked about the Christian Aid Ministries thing and all that. And he said something on there that stuck out to me, and I wanted to get your take on it, Andrew. He said that conservative religious circles, I know I'm paraphrasing him here a little bit, but he said they just have this problem. He said they tend to have this problem. The way I took it was bad.
Right.
And so my question to you is that a thing? And does the conservative holiness movement have it worse than we would think? Because it's easy. We always had the Catholic Church growing up.
Right.
It still is the butt of everybody's jokes.
Right.
But the Catholic Church is very large. It's very rich. And reporters like to poke around.
Yeah,
so
true.
therefore it got exposed. And also like you said earlier, Andrew, it just kept coming a little bit closer and closer to home.
Right.
And now it just makes me wonder. It's like, okay, do we have a big issue here that we just don't know about?
Yeah, I don't know that we can guess, how prevalent it is based on. I mean, I remember in John's video there, he talks about 4 guys riding in a car together, and that was pretty intense there. And at the same time, so to back up and answer your question, I mean, I think that there are some sort of baked in risk factors for conservative communities. So you have this situation where it's a closed group of people, typically, where sort of separatism is sort of celebrated, and so is sort of group identity. So if someone were to come out and share a story about a leader or the son of a leader or something, or a daughter of a leader, something like that, then potentially you're distancing yourself from where much of your primary identity lies, right? So it's almost like accusing a family member because our shared faith community is so close. So I think there's that component. And then I do think that, because of there are theological commitments that make it such that, we don't want to believe the worst in someone. And so as a result, there tends to be sort of almost a public minimizing when somebody does sin. We sort of excuse it and rationalize it. And so there are people who say, perhaps even accurately, like if I did come forward and make a disclosure, I wouldn't be believed. I would be the bad person. I would be, sowing discord. I would be, for instance, if it's a young lady, saying, what were you wearing? How were you acting?
Yes.
What did you do? Kindness upon yourself. And I think those sort of risk factors are sort of baked in to communities of faith that are like ours.
That's a good topic you brought up, because it is true. Instead, it sounds bad, but instead of believing these victims, and it becomes what did you do to ask for this?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
We've
and
heard that before.
That becomes a problem in each topic that we bring this up. What did you do to cause this to happen to you? And these are children that are being hurt, and by usually adults. If I remember right, when I was in school, I think they said it was close to up to 70% of the people that are abusers are adults. So it just brings up a lot of questions,
Yeah, that's something too that Andrew, you just mentioned about the theological commitment and all that.
Right.
It seems like there's a lot of it when I'm talking to people from the conservative holiness movement. You'll mention these stories, and it's like they automatically jump to this place of disbelief. There's no well, let's find out. It's no.
Yeah.
There's no chance in heck that happened.
Right.
And it just, me and you both know people like that.
Right.
That are, they just automatically discount what the victim says.
And it becomes too, you're going to turn against the church, the only thing you've ever known. You're going to alienate yourself. You're going to be shunned because you've brought up discord. You're bringing up issues that, oh my goodness, yes, that's so terrible, but you don't know for sure it actually happened. So that it becomes more disbelief than it does actually digging into a little bit deeper and checking out and seeing what these kids are saying.
Yeah.
Conservative groups also tend to platform men rather than others. So the idea that women would make an accusation or a child would make an accusation, the default is going to be, but 2% of the time people, accusations are false. So how do we know this isn't one of those 2%?
Right.
And so, most, I know here, where I attend church, there are 2 women on the church board. I don't believe there are any women on the mission board, and then there's 1 woman on the college board. So 3 out of 36 are women. That's more than I think a lot of places have.
Yes, it is. Yep, that's a lot more. Wow.
That's, so we're now talking about listening to historically marginalized voices, that are telling us, hey, things are not okay. So, or not listening to them because they don't speak up because they're afraid that there's absolutely nothing is going to be done. I've worked with a number of people who are victims in situations very similar to what John has shared, who have said, were I to come forward, I would be ridiculed. Nothing would come of it. I don't have any proof. It will be my word against theirs. I'm not willing to identify myself as a victim. And so back to, sort of those opening few minutes there, that John was able to do so and do so graciously and be a testimony.
Right.
I'm not at all pressuring anybody else to feel as though they have to be as vulnerable as John has. But I do think that John has demonstrated that, he didn't catch on fire, and, that he's actually, people have been very supportive of his. I shouldn't say that. I don't know if he caught on fire or not. But
did you catch on fire, John?
Good point.
I did not.
Okay, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. So I think that it probably. I imagine that of those, I can't remember how many thousand people have watched it, John. I'm sure that there are hundreds who sat there thinking to themselves, "What if I talked about what happened to me? What if I made a disclosure? Can God help me in the same way that He helped John to be this sort of missionary?" Speaking up on this issue.
Also, when it comes to the psychological battles that you face, a lot of people feel like they deserved it or they did something, like you said, because whenever people are asking the questions, what did you do to make this happen to you? It becomes more like the victim was the reason why it even happened in the first place. So then you're kind of going back to that, would they be afraid to speak up? Because of all the questions, you did something to make that happen to you. So of course you're not going to say anything.
Well, I think there's also this thing of, and we've talked about this, Kanan, some of the episodes prior, we've hit on this quite a bit. That's some of the danger, I think, too, in giving this almost deity-like status to humans, because humans are flawed.
Right.
And
sure.
humans will do things that they shouldn't do. But then when you have a movement that puts its complete trust, like I said, I remember the evangelists, man, I looked at those guys as if they said it, then God had directly told it to them.
Exactly.
Now, and obviously I'm generalizing here. You know, I'm not saying everybody's out there, you know, going after kids. I'm not saying that at all. But I think that it gets dangerous when you just put blind faith into something that.
Yeah, it's true.
Into an individual that then as an organization.
I find it interesting that Andrew mentioned too, what the men are deemed as being a little bit, you know, more superior, if I can say that, than the women and the children. The women are told, you know, you're supposed to talk to your husbands about these issues. Well, what if the husband is the reason why they're in this position in the first place? Or the children can't talk to the mother because the mother's also being abused by the husband. And then if they talk to anybody, they'll be like, well, you should have talked to your husband about this. And then the pastor or whoever will go talk to the husband. And then the husband, he'll go home and beat the living daylights out of the kids or the wife. You know, there's so many instances that I've heard of from different people that it's a recipe for disaster if they do stand up and speak up.
I'll tell you something else that always, that has kind of been a bother in the back of my mind, guys, is I would hear these stories and I was afraid that maybe I was just making too much of something. You know, when you get in this thing where you start finding faults with an organization, then I get scared sometimes that I've put too much emphasis on it. But then, you know, John steps forward and then Dr. Graham gets a hold of me, and then I was basically sitting there with, you know, my eyes were like this big around, like, maybe I'm not making too much of this thing, you know?
Like you weren't trying to stir the pot, but the pot's like right in front of you, starting to turn on its own, and you're like, whoa, what's going on here?
The pot stirred itself.
Right.
One thing that I guess, realized or noticed after, you know, after confronting him or whatever, the first thing that automatically that I felt, I guess, and then a few days afterwards, was almost a guilt of, you know, you have made this a public thing and you've made him, you know, deal with this publicly. And I don't know, like you haven't shown grace to him. If that makes sense. Of course, I've been in therapy. I understand how to think through these things and whatever. But in that process, it was almost as not trying to say like God spoke to me, but that God does give us grace, but there are still consequences. There's still earthly consequences for earthly decisions, even though there might not be eternal consequences. And right after that video came out, probably 2 weeks later, I spoke in a small group setting at a youth convention to boys. We're talking about sex and stuff. And that was one of the things that God kind of showed me through that convention and just answering questions, was that there are consequences for decisions that you make.
Right. And
that, you know, grace covers eternal consequences, but nowhere in the Bible does it say that it covers earthly consequences.
Andrew, the reason I wanted to have you on, I think the reason you got a hold of me was, you know, I didn't see a lot of this in my church growing up. I mean, it probably was there, but I wasn't put dead in the face with it. I'm an uneducated dude. I don't know how to recognize this kind of thing. And if I do recognize it, I'm helpless as what to do about it. So what can everybody that's listening, I'm sure there's some that are in places of higher authority at their church or just people that attend regularly, what can we do to recognize if this is happening? Are there any telltale signs or, you know, of both a victim and a predator? Or, you know, what kind of steps can a church take to help thwart this kind of thing before it happens?
Yeah, those are great questions. And one thing that I feel like I need that needs to be stressed is, on some level, some damage was done to relationships when we were encouraged back sort of post 9/11. If you see something, say something, right? As though we should all be spying on our friends and neighbors, all thinking, what could they be capable of? Is there a terrorist cell in the dorm room across the hall? And so I don't want things to be that way. I don't want, I took my 3 youngest children out to play basketball at the park this afternoon. I don't want somebody to drive by and think, hey, wait a minute,
right?
40-year-old guy, 3 kids under 7, what's going on over there? I don't want us to get into that sort of mindset where we're constantly trying to assume the worst out of everyone. But certainly parents need to be very, very intentional about cultivating relationships with their children where they feel like they can come to them. Where my children, I've got eight kids, 4 boys, 4 girls, oldest is 20, youngest is 4. I want to have a relationship with them where if anybody is doing anything, any sort of grooming, any sort of inappropriate action towards them, that they would immediately say, I got to talk to my dad about that. Mm-hmm. So all of the, and certainly there are other adults in life, youth pastors need to be cultivating relationships, safe relationships where kids who are being victimized or even being groomed for victimization can go. There aren't telltale or however you call that signs where where it's just this very clear thing, right? Personalities are different.
Right.
But a lot of times when I talk to people, and again, I'm mostly at this stage of my career, I'm mostly talking to adults who are talking about being victimized as children. I'm not typically talking to children. But when they're talking, they're saying, I felt like I had significant problems in school, just sort of came out of nowhere, and really complicated, just a big change in relationships and a change in self-esteem and a change in my desire to be alone alone with certain individuals or, those sorts of things. I think that we need to be close enough to our children as parents that we're recognizing when there's those sorts of changes. But certainly if there's a kid who feels really hypersensitive to touch or is scared to be alone with any particular individual because they don't know who to trust because there has been victimization, those sorts of situations are things that we need to, at that point, keep an eye on and say, could there be something there? If we've got an adult who's always seems to be trying to find ways where they're alone with individuals one-on-one or that sort of thing, I think that we do need to be screening those who work with our youth better. I think we need to be providing better supervision, at youth camps and those sorts of environments, so that we're minimizing the chance of people being able to act out. I think that when somebody does demonstrate that they are a risk, the adult or an older child for that matter, we need to take additional steps, not simply say, well, this person has gone to the altar and so they've been fully restored. And so now I want to make them look bad or feel bad. So we'll let them continue because this is now under the blood.
Yes.
And
yes.
I heard Sarah Fry say, if it's sometimes under the blood means under the rug. And,
very good. Very good.
A situation where we're allowing kids to continue to be victimized by not speaking to the issue. There aren't. I mean, there's a list of things that are common. Kids who are on the age. Sometimes kids who've been sexually abused are having problems controlling their bladder. It's almost as though they're dissociating from that part of their body, or suddenly they're itching a lot more and those sorts of things. But that could also be explained by other things. So it can't be assumed that because those sorts of physical things are happening, that there has to be abuse, right? Having a big change in self-esteem during teen years doesn't automatically assume that somebody has been sexually abused. But if you've got a number of these things all happening, it's definitely something to have cultivated a relationship where you can say, hey, let's go out to eat and talk about, what's going on with you. Has somebody taken advantage of you? Has somebody, been inappropriate towards you? And having cultivated a relationship with our own children and those we minister with, that they would feel comfortable in making that sort of disclosure.
So you're basically saying like there's no one thing,
right?
But if you see like some things starting to stack up, you might want to take a second look. Is that kind of what I'm picking up?
Yeah. So let me tell you a quick story. I was recently at an event, and a couple rows in front of me were parents, and the row between the parents and where I was sitting were the grandparents and the children of the parents, right? So sitting with grandma and grandpa. Mm-hmm. And one of the kids' boys, a book slid down the pew and went underneath the parents' pew. And so dad reached, people aren't going to see this with audio only, but dad reached down and grabbed the book, and he turned to hand it to the row behind him. And when he did, the kids all ducked like dad was about to hit him with the book. And I sat in my pew thinking, oh my goodness, like these children are so afraid of their dad's, their dad with his hand in the air, that they're afraid he's going to hit them with a book in the middle of church. Now that's me, and that's because of the stories that I hear all the time. Yeah. And so I need to recognize, okay, there could be other reasons why this sort of thing is happening. But if there were other, outside just that one situation, if there were other things where these kids seem to be struggling, I would, that would cause me to feel, and that's not reportable. It's not something I'm calling CPS on, but it certainly would be something that I would be more aware of, what is it that's going on in this family, and should there be some sort of intervention?
Actually, it brings up and you don't have to answer this if you don't want to, purely personal question for you. You said that you see these things on a regular basis. Does that, after a while, does that just tend to kind of eat away at you?
Yeah, absolutely it does. Absolutely it does. So I wasn't, my parents came to faith when I was a teenager. And then we moved from, I'm from Canada. We moved from Canada down to Hobe Sound. So I was in this sort of environment in my high school and college years, and didn't see these sorts of things. Never had no idea, didn't realize, all kinds of things were going on that I was just totally unaware of. And then, like I said, going into community mental health, right, seeing these people and these broken families because they were lost, because they'd never been confronted with the truth of the gospel, because they didn't see themselves or anybody else as created in the image of God. So to now hear stories from people who I feel know better, or certainly should know better, certainly testify to knowing better, it can be quite complicated. Several years ago, I spoke at the Outreach and Bus Convention on the issue of sexual abuse. And I realized about 15 minutes in that people were like 40% of the people were crying. And they weren't crying just because they had empathy for people who were hurt, but because they were sitting there listening to me talk about what should have been done to have protected them or their children. And they just didn't know what to do. And I ended up, my session was at 2:00 in the afternoon. It went from 2 until 3. And I left the room at 10 o'clock that night because people wanted to stay and talk about their story and what they should do with what had happened to them. So absolutely. It's what God's called me to do. It's what God's called me to do. And I have the personality for it. I'm a very empathic person. So, I cried watching John's video as well. I think a further complication is that I appreciate you guys wanting to talk about it. I appreciate, Grace Story had me on to talk about spiritual abuse here recently. And I noticed the podcast after me is on sexual abuse and those sorts of things. But I'm not here. I didn't hear anybody from the denomination that John was talking about on the video, the camp. I haven't heard anything about any sort of public statement from that. I've not heard any CHM leader call this out. I've not, even whether it's individual level or on a systemic level or on a we need to do a better job. I've not heard anything like that. And so as somebody who navigates these waters all the time, I don't think it's that hard to say we need to do a better job protecting our kids and making sure that the people that we're entrusting our children to are themselves who they present themselves as. Right. But yet, I'm not hearing. I've seen a few. So let me say that. I shouldn't say I haven't seen any. I think David Fry, I would consider him a CHM leader. I think he shared John's video, made a comment. I think several others have, but not very many. And, that's bothersome to me. That, as you said, it's easy to poke fun at the Catholic Church. It's easy to say about Bill Cosby or even all the way to Bill Gothard. Mm-hmm. But to identify that maybe we need to do some things differently in our dormitories or our camps or our Sunday schools, those sorts of things. We're still not having those conversations.
It's always been kind of interesting to me. The church that Kane and I attend, we attend the same church. The church that we attend at this point, within like the last maybe 3 years, you can correct me if I'm wrong, Kanan, but I think within the last 3 years, we've started requiring everyone that's involved in ministry at any level, volunteering or whatever, that they have to go through background checks. They have to take training on how to recognize trauma, how to recognize sexual abuse, things to look for, all that stuff. But a lot of youth camps, a lot of kids camps, and then just down to just churches in general, that's not even something we do, is just to screen the people that are involved. You might just have any Joe Blow running a dorm full of teens that has never been through any screening. And that, to me, that's just something simple that could be done. I work with bus teens and underprivileged teens through my job and through the church. And I've had even some teens' parents ask questions like, so are the people that are here, the leaders here, the people in charge, the volunteers, have they been screened, or have they, been background checked or whatever? And to me, it's sad that a bus teen or an underserved, underprivileged teen, whatever, that their parents would be asking those questions, but holiness kids, if you want to say that, conservative holiness, whatever word you want to use, that those parents aren't asking the same questions.
Yeah.
John, do you think, is that out of, and I don't say this in a mean way, but is that out of ignorance? Where I know when I was really deep into CHM, I was very sheltered, had no idea this was an issue.
Right.
Is that something that comes out of ignorance? It's not realizing that it can happen?
I think that maybe it could be ignorance. You or Kanan, one of you, had mentioned somewhere along the line about this idea of blind trust. We just trust everybody. Mm-hmm. Like Andrew said, not saying that we shouldn't trust people, but just have a blind trust in everyone and everything without paying attention and asking questions. And then, honestly, it's just an awkward conversation. And
True.
And we just don't like to have awkward conversations, especially in the backgrounds that we've grown up in, and a lot of other people. I've been around a lot of denominations that are not quote unquote holiness denominations, and it's the same. It's not different throughout. We don't talk about sex. We don't talk about pornography. We don't talk about, because those are awkward things to talk about. And when you don't talk about those things, that's the situation I grew up in. We didn't talk about. Sex was dirty to talk about in our house.
Yep.
And so, to back up to the very beginning of the episode, to answer Andrew's question, that was one of the reasons why I didn't talk about it, just because that was something you didn't talk about. It was a dirty subject. Mm-hmm. And so I think that it becomes an issue where it's something we don't talk about, and leaders don't want to address that because it's awkward, and you don't want to have that awkward conversation.
That's a good point. Because like in the holiness movement, I know, I'm just speaking from personal experience here, I had no idea anything about sex until I was about 18 years old. And it's nothing against my parents. It's just like that conversation never came up. They never explained anything really to me. I mean, I knew about animals. We had animals everywhere. Right. And it never clicked though in my head, like with humans.
Yeah.
I was just like, this innocent little girl. I didn't know nothing. And it's interesting how the ball is being dropped when it comes to the conversation of sex. I understand it is awkward. Like no one wants to have that conversation, but that is a ball that's being dropped as parents. And that's something like, as a new mom, we're going to be parents here soon. These are signs that we're aware of now that we need to act on. Yeah. And like, for example, with Kane and Mariah and their little boy, they have to make choices and stuff about what goes on with him.
Right.
That's a big obligation as parents. Like this is a really, really difficult topic for new parents or young parents.
You know, this conversation is both, it gives me some hope and scares me to death all at the same time.
That's a fair statement.
Like what Andrew said, you know, there's not very many of these CHM leaders or even just church leaders in general that are coming out and saying, let's address this problem.
That are open to trying to fix the problem.
Right.
Yes, that's a good point.
Like the one guy was at Canaan. Me and you was around him for years at Clinton Camp. When he got busted, this was after me and Canaan had left. It had been that many years ago. The prosecuting attorney said this is one of the worst cases of child abuse that he had ever seen in the county he was at.
And it was like learned behavior.
Roamed camp for years, you know.
Yes.
Then my mind starts racing. If I'm not careful, I'll get guilty of what Andrew's telling us not to do.
Right, I know.
Witch hunting in my mind.
But to be fair, there were warning signs. Your mother said over and over, there is something wrong with those men.
Yeah.
And it came out as being, like you said, one of the worst situations that the judge had ever seen.
Yeah.
And was that talked about? Do you remember?
Of course not.
No, they didn't talk about it at the camp.
And so we know it's around. Now we just got to be vigilant.
So Andrew, question, I guess, the same question that Phil asked me. Why do you think that it's not talked about? Why do you think that leaders aren't addressing it?
Yeah, so that's complicated, but I would say that so much rides on theology that says that we can attain a state of grace whereby we're not capable of doing these sorts of things. And since there's no real measurable metric to determine somebody's particular state of grace, somebody says that they're entirely sanctified. Somebody says that the root of sin is gone. What does that mean? And then how do we question them, question their motives in a particular situation? How do we question their behavior that appears to not align with that without making it look as though we are questioning our own theology? I think that's part of it. I think that we've created, and this is a generations long thing. This isn't just people today, but we've created this sort of defense against the system sort of thing, such that, we would never want to get Child Protective Services involved. We would never want to get the law involved. We would never want to participate in any sort of interview or something like that. We'd never want to reach outside the community in order to talk about, and this is better than it has been, as you mentioned, but to talk about what should we do to protect ourselves and protect the most vulnerable among us. People have been conditioned to believe that since you mentioned your wife as a social worker, right, that social workers are inherently evil and should not be trusted, right? Their role is to take children from loving parents who just because they spank their child, that is not what social workers do. Right? Counselors do not tell people how to be safe and secure in their sin, right? Which is what I've heard somebody say about me, right? That is not what I do. Do not get glee from removing children from parental guardianship. So, but those are certainly the sorts of things that you've heard and that I've heard. And so there's that whole, I don't want to bring somebody from the outside in here. We'll handle this ourselves. And like I said, handling it oftentimes has been, sweep it under the rug. So we have to be safe, right? We have to present ourselves as safe, and we have to present ourselves as, if you come to us, we will believe you. And that has been a huge problem, right? Where people have been vocal, leadership has been vocal in public situations to say, we do not believe people who come forward as victims. When I posted years ago questions about Bill Gothard and his ministry and the accusations coming out against him, it was, touch not the Lord's anointed. It was, all of those sorts of things. We need to believe people, right? We need to report it if something has happened. And, I could tell story after story, and I won't, because I want to be really careful about confidentiality. But churches where where it's been generational, and you've got victim after victim after victim, and people even knew that things were going on because their own children had been victimized, but they didn't do anything about it, and that allowed more and more and more people, and just the tentacles of sin just go everywhere because it wasn't reported, it wasn't accurately addressed. We need to stop lecturing people and start loving people. I've had numbers of people say to me, we talked about the whole self-blame, somebody mentioned a few minutes ago, and that I've counseled who said, this happened when I was 11, and when I went to youth camp at 15, I realized it must have been my fault. I think, one lady said to me, I remember that I was wearing a red jumper the first time I was sexually abused. That must be the problem. So I stopped wearing red. Those sorts of things, rather than loving kids, we lecture them. Really, as mentioned, the whole not talking about sex thing. Now, I don't have a problem talking about that. So, but not every camp, not every youth camp is going to have me come and talk. And then we have to be willing to protect survivors over protecting the system. We have to be willing to say, something's going on here, and we need to get to the root of it, and we need to protect the dignity, protect the image of God in this image bearer, and not be worried about what this looks like to our church or to our movement if people come forward and say this is something that's happened.
Yeah.
Whew, you're dropping bombs, man.
Right when he started, that whole not being tempted, not sinning ever. Yep. Like that it becomes the biggest issue, because they're like, they'd never do that. They're saved, sanctified. Like they don't want to do those things.
I agree with everything you just said, Andrew.
That was, wow.
That was perfect.
So just to be clear though, I'm saying this stuff from inside the house. Okay. So I'm not throwing shade on any of you. I'm not somebody who's not right here, right now. I attend what I think is still the largest CHM church. I spoke at 2 CHM churches last week, and I'll speak at more in the future. So this is where my faith identity lies.
Yes.
But I recognize that doesn't mean that we can't. I mean, I love people and I love institutions too much to be able to say that there isn't a problem here, that there aren't systemic issues that keep people from saying something has happened to me, or that even abusers, right? And even people, I'm an empathic enough person to say that I want to foster an environment where somebody who has done wrong can say, I want to come forward to my pastor or to my church and receive restoration, which may involve reporting if it was related to a child, and those sorts of things, right? It isn't just about protecting the victim. It's also about protecting the victim who has probably become a perpetrator. So it's not that every victim becomes a perpetrator, but almost every perpetrator will acknowledge their own victimization. And so even while watching that Indiana sort of Gestapo, whatever that law enforcement strategy is called, or pseudo law enforcement strategy is called, even in watching that, like, part of me is just broken for John's abuser to say what was going on in that guy's life, that this is what he was doing, preying on young men like John. Where was his victimization? What's his story? And it's a problem. And is it more than it is in the world? Is it more than it is in the Catholic Church? I don't know. It's more than it should be. And so that's why it's reasonable to say, hey, I'm going to spend an evening talking to you guys and your audience to say, we've got to do better on these sorts of things. We've got to be educated, and we've got to not be afraid to speak up if we see something.
Do you see a lot of these instances being reported? I guess that's my question. Because I know the church likes to keep things under wraps. This is terrible. I get that. Totally get it. But when you mentioned, it needs to be reported, do you actually see churches following through and reporting people of power that are in the church of these crimes? Because usually they're like, no, we're just going to cover it underneath the table like the Catholic Church did. Do you see things being reported?
Yeah. So when I worked in community settings, I worked with kids. So I worked with 12 to 18-year-old male victims of sexual abuse. That's what I did. Mm-hmm. And so, not every case, but if it had not already been reported, then when a disclosure was made to me, I would be required by law to report it and would follow through on that. Typically now I'm seeing somebody who's 30 who's saying, this is what happened to me when I was 12. Now, in most states, there's no statute of limitations on crimes against children. And so somebody at 30 absolutely could report what happened to them when they were 12. I can't report it unless they want me to. So that's the difference. So I'm mandated to report if a child makes a disclosure, but I am not allowed to report if an adult makes a disclosure about what happened when they were a child. And the vast majority of people choose not to report because, and this is not a failure of the holiness movement, this is a failure of the criminal justice system, that too many people go through years of trying to make accurate statements, and at the end of the day, they spend months and months and months trying to do this, and justice is not served anyway. So they've seen enough situations that people will sit in my office or talk to me on Zoom and say, it's not worth the risk of what this would do to me emotionally to relive this over and over and over again and not ever really know if justice will come. In John's situation, this is a semi-public figure. And so even if he doesn't serve jail time, John on some level feels like there's been some sort of justice meted out because, I assume he's going to, I assume he lost his job and won't ever have that sort of high profile position. But the idea that guy would go to prison, and John, I don't know if you're pursuing anything like that at all, but the idea that guy would go to prison is very, very slight, so it's a disincentive for people to come forward, not because of church failure, but because of legal system failure.
Okay.
Yeah. Wow. Well, we've been going about an hour. We should probably think about wrapping it up, you think? Do
you have any other advice, Andrew, about what we can do from here?
Yeah, I was thinking about like any place that people can learn more about this. I know you've got a website too, if you want to.
Like, can holiness young people find you? Things like that, because I'm sure this is going to get a lot of attention.
Sure, absolutely. So my website is just drandrewgraham.com, or they can find me on Facebook or Twitter or wherever, those sorts of things. There's ways to report things anonymously. Again, not every time will that sort of be investigated. A lot of things are different by jurisdiction. Different states handle things differently, and that can make it difficult for me to make some sort of blanket statement about what you should do and exactly what will happen as a result. But typically, I'll say this: if you've got, not to equate traumatic sexual abuse of a child to a minor injury, but if you have a sliver on the bottom of your foot and you tell yourself that it's too painful to pull that sliver out, it's going to fester and fester and fester. And I at one point had a lady in her late 70s come to me and say she didn't want counseling, didn't want therapy. She just felt she needed to tell somebody her story, and somebody had recommended that she come, and she traveled to Hope Sound, came to my office because she felt like she needed to just get it off her chest what had happened to her 60 years ago, something like that.
Wow.
You've got to find the safe people in your life to share your story with. And, if it's causing distress in your marriage, in your family, at work, those sorts of things, then certainly there's, as we said at the top of the show, right, there's no shame in reaching out to a counselor, reaching out to a therapist and saying, I need somebody to help me to re-walk through some of the darkest days of my life so that I'm not reliving them over and over and over again.
Yeah, I just bring it up because I know personally whenever a therapist or someone to talk to was brought up, oh, they're not of the holiness movement, they won't understand. They're going to have a worldly view on things, which, brings up why he is so special in this situation, because he is a holiness movement. He believes in it.
Exactly,
and
right.
He's able to respond in a way that, the church is going to be like, oh, okay. Yeah, he's actually one of us, and he feels this way. It might have a little bit more of an impact.
I was thinking the exact
on young
same
people, or even their parents, grandparents, whoever it may be.
But it's easy. I mean, it's very easy to discount this show because we're not. Kane and me, not the best looking dude sitting around talking into a microphone. a couple rednecks says holler. But I think, and Andrew, I'm sure you understand this. But it just hit me when you were telling me how powerful your position is right now.
Yes.
Like you said, to be talking from, you're inside the house, and that's where people are more likely to listen, my opinion. Yeah,
I know for sure with like just the holiness group that I came from.
Mm-hmm. It's got to be from inside.
It has to be from inside.
Yeah.
It cannot be, Dr. James Dobson. Well, he left us. That's why he's,
right.
I've heard so many different people, and I'm kind of like, yeah, but Dr. James Dobson was right about a lot of things, and you still don't listen. So, yeah.
Well, this has been very good, very powerful. A lot of good information here. I like this when we get educated people on that didn't make us, rising tide raises all boats.
we appreciate so much, Dr. Andrew. It's been really eye-opening for us.
It's been very good. Thank you very much, Andrew.
Yeah, I'm honored to be able to share and John to share some time with you. I appreciate it.
Yep. And if there's Kanan, John, you guys got anything you want to say before we close it out?
Just like Andrew said, there's no shame in it. Get counseling, go to a therapist. After all this happened, I decided, hey, it's time to go back to counseling again, opened up some fresh things, started counseling again. It's okay. There's nothing wrong with it. There's no shame in it. And I don't even go to Holiness One. I'm poor, so I go to one the government provides for me.
Yes, hey.
Not that I'm in the house. I'm just on the porch.
Just on the porch. I like it. Me and Kanan's out in the yard somewhere.
In lawn chairs.
All right. That'll do it for us. We'll catch y'all next time.